There's a fruit most people in North America have never tasted, never seen in a grocery store, never heard mentioned at a farmer's market, and yet in parts of South America, New Zealand, and certain corners of Europe, it's just Tuesday. Something you grab off a bush in your backyard and eat standing up. The gap between how common it is somewhere else and how invisible it is here is kind of strange when you actually look at it. This is about that gap. The feijoa, sometimes called pineapple guava, sometimes called just feijoa depending on where you're from, is one of those plants that sounds made up when you first describe it. It tastes like a combination of pineapple, guava, mint, and something almost floral that doesn't quite have a name. The texture is soft and granular, somewhere between a ripe pear and a kiwi. You cut it in half and scoop it out with a spoon. That's basically the whole experience. And it grows on a bush, a frost-tolerant bush, one that can handle temperatures well below freezing, survives neglect, produces fruit without much intervention, and keeps coming back year after year. When you hear all of that together, the obvious question is, why has almost nobody in the US heard of this thing? Part of the answer is probably just geography and agricultural history. Feijoa is native to the highlands of South America, particularly parts of Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina. It was introduced to Europe in the late 1800s, made its way to New Zealand sometime after that, and became genuinely popular there. New Zealanders eat it so casually that there's basically a running cultural joke about feijoa season. Everyone's neighbors are leaving bags of them on porches because the trees produce more than any single household can use. In the US, it never quite caught on the same way. It was introduced to California in the early 20th century and planted in some gardens and orchards, but it didn't break into mainstream commercial agriculture. And that's sort of where things stayed. Commercial fruit production has specific requirements that have nothing to do with taste. Shelf life matters, uniformity matters. How well something survives shipping matters. Feijoa is fragrant, soft when ripe, and doesn't hold up well over long distances. It bruises, it has a short window. Those aren't qualities that make supermarket buyers excited, even if the actual eating experience is genuinely unusual. So it stayed on the edges, in specialty nurseries, in the gardens of people who'd grown up with it somewhere else, or stumbled across it and became quietly obsessed. There's a certain type of plant that acquires a following not through mass distribution, but through word of mouth, through one person handing a fruit to another person and watching their face change. Feijoa is that kind of plant, which is interesting because the barriers to growing it are remarkably low. Not zero, nothing is zero, but lower than you'd expect for something this underrepresented. It handles cold. That's probably the detail that surprises people most. Most fruits with a tropical flavor profile, things that taste like they belong somewhere warm, come from plants that collapse the moment frost arrives. Feijoa doesn't. Established plants can tolerate temperatures down into the mid-teens Fahrenheit, which puts them comfortably into growing zones that most people wouldn't associate with anything resembling a tropical fruit. Zone 7, Zone 8, even parts of Zone 6 with some protection. That's a significant portion of the country. It does have preferences though. It wants full sun. It does better with consistent moisture but doesn't like sitting in wet soil. It's reasonably drought tolerant once established, which is partly why it naturalized so well in parts of New Zealand and coastal California. That kind of Mediterranean climate with dry summers suits it. But it's not exclusively a dry climate plant. It adapts. The pollination situation is worth understanding. Most feijoa varieties are self-fertile to some degree, meaning a single plant can produce fruit, but production increases significantly with a second plant nearby, ideally a different variety, for cross-pollination. It's not a strict requirement in the way that some fruit trees demand it, but if you're wondering why a single feijoa bush is giving you only a handful of fruit, that's often the explanation. The flowers, by the way, are edible. They're sweet with a slightly exotic flavor, and they attract pollinators aggressively. Bees visit them constantly. The visual effect of a feijoa in full bloom, these small white and red flowers against dark green foliage, is actually striking, though most people grow it for the fruit and overlook the flowers entirely. Harvest timing is one of the genuinely tricky parts. Feijoas don't change color when they ripen, they stay green. The standard guidance is to wait until they begin to fall from the plant on their own. That's usually the clearest signal that the fruit is ready. Some people will gently shake a branch and collect whatever falls. Others just do daily checks during season and pick up what's dropped. If you harvest too early, the flavor is there but muted. The signature aroma is subdued. The texture is firmer and slightly astringent. Wait too long and the window closes fast. Overripe feijoas ferment quickly and the flavor gets strange. The ideal moment is brief, which is part of why you don't see them stacked in produce sections. That brevity is actually part of what makes them interesting to grow at home though. The whole experience of feijoa season is compressed and immediate. You're eating them as they come. You're not storing them for 6 months. There's something almost forced about the present tense of it. This fruit exists right now in this week, and then it's done until next year. The flavor itself is difficult to describe to someone who hasn't had one, which is probably another barrier to wider adoption. Pineapple guava gives you a starting point, but it's not quite right. The pineapple note is real, but it's not sweet aggressive the way fresh pineapple can be. There's a coolness to it, almost like the distant cousin of mint, without actually tasting like mint. Something vaguely floral underneath all of it. Some people taste banana, some taste strawberry. The same fruit can register differently depending on the variety, the ripeness, and honestly probably just the person. It's not a universally loved flavor. I think that's worth saying plainly. Some people eat one and become immediately loyal to it. Others find it strange, a little perfume-like, not quite landing right. It occupies a similar cultural space to things like durian or marmite. You don't land casually in the middle with feijoa. You either get it or you don't. In New Zealand, the cultural attachment to feijoa goes well beyond just eating the fruit fresh. There's feijoa jam, feijoa crumble, feijoa chutney, feijoa and apple cake, smoothies, cider. The fruit appears in school lunchboxes, in baked goods at cafes, in the back of people's cars during season because they're trying to give them away before they over-ripen. There's a mild running anxiety during feijoa season about the sheer quantity of them, which is an interesting problem to have. That overproduction is real, not exaggerated. A mature feijoa hedge, they're often grown as privacy screens in New Zealand gardens because the plants are dense and hold their shape well, can produce more fruit than a household knows what to do with. That's part of why the bag on the neighbor's porch thing became a cultural trope. The plant doesn't really hold back. In the US, interest has been growing slowly. Specialty nurseries that carry feijoa often have waiting lists. Gardening communities online have these periodic moments where someone posts about their feijoa harvest, and the comment section fills with questions from people who've never encountered it. The pattern looks a lot like how interest in other unusual edibles has spread, slowly, through genuine enthusiasm, not through advertising. Whether that translates into wider commercial availability is harder to predict. The shelf life problem hasn't changed. The uniformity problem hasn't changed. Supermarket supply chains weren't built for fruits that need to be eaten within a day or two of ripening. So the most likely trajectory is probably continued slow growth in home gardening and specialty markets, rather than a sudden mainstream moment. Maybe that's fine. There's something that happens to a fruit when it becomes fully commercialized. The varieties shift toward what ships well, what looks consistent, what holds color. Flavor often isn't the first criterion. The feijoas people find at home, grown from a specific variety they chose, picked when they actually fall, eaten the same day, those are probably better than anything a mass market version would look like anyway. There's a broader pattern here that feijoa fits into. It's not really just about this one fruit. There are dozens of edible plants, fruits, greens, roots, things that grow along trails and in fields and at the edges of backyards that are deeply familiar in one part of the world and essentially invisible in another. Not because they're inferior, not because they're difficult to find, simply because most people were never shown them. And that's the part that stays with me a little. The knowledge gap is bigger than the availability gap. The plants are often already there. The missing piece is just knowing what you're looking at.
There's actually a small physical guide called the Foldable Forager that I came across while researching this video. It covers over 55 edible plants found across North America, with color images, edible parts, where to find them, that kind of thing. It fits in a wallet, which sounds like a gimmick until you realize the whole point is that it's with you when you're actually outside, not sitting on a shelf at home. It's the kind of thing that makes more sense the more curious you get about what's actually growing around you. I'll leave a link below if you want to take a look.
The map is much larger than the aisle. It always has been.